Silver banners fell from the high ceiling of Blackburn Moon Hall, and every servant in the palace moved, as if the moon itself were watching them work. Long tables stretched across the marble floor, each one dressed in white cloth and lined with crystal cups that caught the candlelight and threw it back in small trembling flashes. Moonstone chandeliers hung above the room like frozen stars, and outside the tall arched windows, workers were still tying white roses to the stone columns, making sure not a single petal touched the ground before the ceremony began. Musicians tuned their instruments near the far windows, filling the empty hall with soft, uneven notes that would soon become music fit for a kingdom's celebration. Long silver curtains moved gently with the evening breeze, and somewhere below the tower, horses stamped and snorted in the courtyard as the first noble carriages began to arrive early, their occupants eager to be seen entering before the crowd grew too thick. Inside a private chamber at the top of the East Tower, Elisa Sheridan stood before a tall mirror, while 3 seamstresses moved around her, pinning and smoothing a pale gold gown that shimmered every time she turned. She was beautiful in the way that made rooms grow quiet, and tonight she wanted that beauty to be undeniable. By the next moonrise, she expected Alpha King Graham Blackburn to stand before the entire Wolf Kingdom and name her his chosen Luna. Her hands trembled slightly as one of the seamstresses tightened the waist of the gown, and she pressed them flat against her stomach to stop the shaking. She had waited a long time for this night, and she was not going to let anyone take it from her. "Careful with the hem," she said sharply to the youngest seamstress, who flinched and adjusted the fabric without complaint. Elisa studied her own reflection, turning slowly, watching the gold catch the light from every angle. She had rehearsed her entrance a dozen times in her mind already. The way she would walk, the way she would smile when Graham's eyes found her across the hall, the way she would accept the crown of moonbond flowers when the ceremony reached its peak. Nearby, in the same chamber, Lady Margot Sheridan stood over a table covered in seating cards, moving them with slow, careful fingers, as though she were arranging pieces on a board rather than names of guests. She lifted one card, read it twice, and set it down again with a small, satisfied smile. "Helena Rosewood," she said quietly, almost to herself. "Seat her close enough to the royal table that she can see everything she lost, far enough that no one forgets she does not belong there anymore." Elisa caught her mother's eyes in the mirror and laughed, though the sound came out thinner than she wanted it to. "She will come," she said. "Poor women always come when someone offers them a taste of a life they can no longer have." 2 noblewomen seated near the window, Lucille Cavendish and Rosalie Stanford, laughed along with her, their fans moving lazily in front of painted faces. Lucille leaned toward Rosalie and whispered something behind her hand, and Rosalie's laughter grew sharper. "I heard she lives above a healer's shop," Lucille said, not bothering to lower her voice much. "Grinding herbs for villagers who cannot even pay her in coin." "How charitable of her," Rosalie replied, smiling behind her fan. "Some women are born for grand halls, and some are born for washing basins. It is only kind that Elisa gives her a chance to remember which one she was born for." Elisa allowed herself to laugh at that, though something in her chest tightened faintly at the sound of her own amusement. But for one small moment, Elisa's smile faltered. A memory rose in her mind before she could stop it. A much younger Helena, brushing tangles out of her hair by candlelight, breaking her only piece of bread in half and giving Elisa the larger piece, carrying her on her back through the manor gardens the summer Elisa's ankle had been sprained. She remembered, too, a night of thunder when she had crawled into Helena's bed shaking, and Helena had wrapped both arms around her and hummed softly until the storm passed and sleep finally came. The memory came and went so quickly that no one in the room noticed it pass across her face. Then her mother's voice returned to her mind the way it always did, patient and certain. Helena abandoned them. Helena was jealous of everything Elisa had. Helena chose a low life because she could not bear to watch her stepsister rise above her. Elisa held on to those words the way a person holds onto a railing on a steep staircase, because letting go of them meant she would have to ask herself questions she did not want answered. "Mother," Elisa said suddenly, quieter than before, "do you truly believe she will come?" Margot did not look up from the seating cards. "She always comes when there is something to be seen," she said. "Poverty makes people curious about the world they were denied. She will not be able to resist seeing it, even knowing it will hurt her to watch. And if it does hurt her—" Margot finally lifted her eyes, meeting her daughter's gaze with a calm that bordered on coldness. "Then she will understand, finally, that some doors do not open twice." In the doorway of the chamber, unnoticed by anyone, an elderly maid named Nina Marlowe stood with a folded cloth in her hands, listening to every word. Her fingers tightened around the cloth until her knuckles turned pale. She knew Helena had not left Rosewood Manor by choice. She knew there had been letters, many of them, written in a careful young hand and sent across the years. And she knew that not one of them had ever reached the person they were meant for. She knew Lord Rosewood's final wish, spoken in the quiet hours before his death, had been buried along with him, or worse, hidden somewhere it could still be found. And she knew that if Helena Rosewood walked into that bright hall tonight, something that had been buried for years was going to rise to the surface, whether anyone in that chamber was ready for it or not. Nina had served the Rosewood and Sheridan households for most of her life, long enough to remember Lord Rosewood as a young man, long enough to remember Helena as an infant wrapped in her mother's arms. She had watched the family break apart, piece by piece after his death, and she had said nothing for years, telling herself it was not her place, that a servant's word carried no weight against a lady's. Tonight, standing in the doorway listening to Margot plan Helena's humiliation with the same calm she might use to plan a menu, Nina felt something old and tired inside her finally begin to shift. She lowered her eyes, turned, and slipped quietly back down the corridor before anyone could ask why she had been standing there so long. Across the river, past the edge of Blackburn territory, in a small village where the streets were made of packed earth instead of polished stone, Helena Rosewood lived in a narrow room above a healer's shop. The room held little: a bed with a thin blanket, a wooden table with one uneven leg, bundles of dried herbs hanging from a low beam near the window, a cracked clay basin for washing, and a single blue dress folded with more care than its worn fabric seemed to deserve. It was not a room that spoke of comfort, but it was a room that spoke of a life carefully kept. Helena knelt beside the low fire, grinding dried chamomile with a stone pestle, her sleeves pushed up past her elbows. Her hands were rough, marked with small burns and scars from years of tending wounds that were not her own, but her face held none of the hardness that such a life might have carved into someone else. She had spent years caring for sick children, comforting old widows through their final winters, and setting the broken bones of pack workers who could not always pay her for the help she gave. She never turned anyone away for lack of coin, and the village had come, slowly, to depend on her more than they depended on the healer whose shop she lived above. Outside her window, the village was waking into evening, a cart rolling slowly over the packed earth road, a dog barking somewhere near the well, the smell of wood smoke rising from a dozen chimneys as families prepared their supper. It was a small life, a quiet one, but it was hers, built with her own two hands out of very little, and there was a kind of peace in that which Helena had learned, slowly, over many hard years, to hold on to. A soft knock came at the door, followed almost immediately by it opening, since the person on the other side rarely waited for an answer. "I brought bread," Mira Ainsworth announced, holding up a small cloth bundle still warm from the oven. She was younger than Helena by a few years, with quick eyes and a habit of noticing everything in a room within seconds of entering it. Her gaze landed immediately on the cream-colored envelope resting on the wooden table. "And I see you already have something more interesting than bread waiting for you." Helena set down the pestle and wiped her hands on her apron before picking up the envelope again, though she had already read its contents twice that morning. "It arrived before sunrise," she said. "A rider from Blackburn territory." Mira took the bread to the table, breaking off a piece and offering it to Helena before speaking again. That's a long way for a letter to travel. What does it say? Elisa is to be named Future Luna, Helena said quietly. Alpha King Graham Blackburn has chosen her. There is to be a moon bond celebration at Blackburn Moon Hall, and I have been invited. Mira's chewing slowed, then stopped altogether. The Sheridans invited you. Elisa did, Helena said, though even as she said it, something in her chest tightened, some old caution she had learned to carry since the year her father died. Helena. Mira set the bread down and took a step closer, her voice losing its light teasing tone. That family has not shown you a single kindness since your father passed. Not one letter in all these years, not one visit, nothing. Now, out of nowhere, they want you standing in their grand hall in front of the whole kingdom? Helena did not answer right away. She walked to the window instead, looking out at the quiet street below, at an old woman sweeping her doorstep, and 2 children chasing a dog between the houses. Her fingers found the small silver pendant at her throat, shaped like a crescent moon, worn smooth from years of being touched exactly this way. I remember her differently than you do, Helena said finally. I remember a little girl who held my hand every time there was a storm because she was afraid of the thunder, and I was not. I remember braiding her hair before she went to bed, and her falling asleep before I finished. That little girl grew into a young woman who let her mother push you out of your own home, Mira said gently, and never once wrote to ask if you were alive or dead. Perhaps, Helena admitted. Or perhaps there is a part of her that still remembers me the way I remember her. I want to know which it is before I decide never to hope for anything from that family again. Mira crossed her arms, unconvinced but no longer arguing quite so hard. And if it is a trap, if Margot means to embarrass you in front of every noble house in the kingdom, then I will endure an evening of whispers, Helena said simply, and come home to my own quiet life afterward, no worse than I was before. I have survived harder things than a room full of strangers looking down on me. She turned from the window and crossed to the small chest at the foot of her bed, opening it to reveal a folded piece of paper, brittle with age, and beneath it, a man's worn leather journal. She did not open either one. She only rested her hand on top of them for a moment, the way she often did when she needed to remember why she had chosen the life she now lived. Her father, Lord Rosewood, had given her the moon pendant the winter before he died, sitting beside her bed, with a fever already beginning to take the color from his face. He had pressed the cold silver into her palm, and folded her fingers around it, and told her that real nobility was never found in a title or a house full of servants. Real nobility, he said, was found in mercy, in the choice to be gentle with people who could give you nothing back. She remembered the weight of his hand over hers, the effort it had cost him even to speak by then, and the steadiness in his eyes despite everything the fever had already taken from his body. He had asked her to promise him one thing before sleep finally claimed him that night, that whatever happened after he was gone, she would not let bitterness harden the softness in her heart. She had promised, not fully understanding then how many years she would need to keep that promise, or how many reasons life would give her to break it. She had carried those words the way she carried the pendant, close and constant, through every hard winter that followed. I will go, Helena said at last, closing the chest gently. Not because I want a place among them again. I do not need their house or their name. I only want to see, with my own eyes, whether any part of the family I lost still exists somewhere in that hall. Mira studied her for a long moment, then sighed, recognizing the particular kind of stubbornness that lived quietly beneath Helena's calm. Then I will help you get ready, she said, even if I still think it is a mistake. Before the two of them settled into preparing the dress, a small interruption came at the door. A farmer's wife holding a feverish toddler, her face pinched with worry. Helena rose at once, setting aside the envelope and every question it carried, and spent the better part of an hour pressing cool cloths to the child's forehead and mixing a gentle tonic from her shelves, speaking softly to the frightened mother the entire time. He will be well by morning, Helena promised, walking the woman to the door once the child's breathing had eased and his small body had finally relaxed into sleep. Keep him warm tonight, and send for me again if the fever rises rather than falls." The farmer's wife pressed a few small coins into Helena's hand, more than she likely could afford to spare, and Helena accepted only half of them, pressing the rest gently back into the woman's palm. "Feed your other children with the rest," she said. "We will settle accounts fully once your harvest comes in." Mira watched the entire exchange from the corner of the room, shaking her head with fond exasperation once the door had closed again. "You will never have two coins to rub together, doing business that way," she said. "I have never needed two coins to rub together," Helena replied, returning to the table and picking up the pestle again, as though the interruption had been the most ordinary thing in the world, which, in her life, it very much was. "I have needed a roof, a fire, and enough bread to share. Everything beyond that has always felt like more than I was owed." They spent the remaining hour before dusk, going through what little Helena owned that might be suitable for a grand hall. Mira holding up ribbons and old pieces of lace against the fabric of the blue dress, trying to find some small way to make it shine a little brighter, without pretending it was something it was not. "We could add this at the collar," Mira suggested, holding up a thin strip of pale lace salvaged from an old shawl. "It would not fool anyone into thinking you are wealthy, but it might remind them you have taste, even without coin." Helena smiled, the first real smile of the evening. "You are a good friend, Mira." "I am a good friend who still thinks you are walking into a den of wolves," Mira said, though she said it gently, and continued pinning the lace with careful fingers. That evening, after Mira had gone home, Helena opened her wardrobe and drew out her only formal dress, a pale blue gown that had once belonged to her mother, mended carefully at the sleeves where the fabric had begun to thin. She held it against herself in front of the small cracked mirror, smoothing the front with both hands. It was not gold, it was not silk. It would not compare to anything the noble women of Blackburn territory would wear that night. She thought, briefly, of turning back the letter, of sending word that she could not attend after all, sparing herself whatever humiliation Margot likely had planned. But beneath that thought sat another, quieter one. The memory of Elisa's small hand in hers during a thunderstorm many years ago, and the stubborn, aching hope that some piece of that little girl might still be waiting somewhere inside the woman she had become. "I will go with dignity," she whispered to her own reflection, "even if I have nothing else to bring with me." She folded the dress carefully over the back of a chair, blew out the candle, and lay awake a long while before sleep finally came, listening to the quiet sounds of the village settling into night around her, wondering what tomorrow would bring. The journey to Blackburn territory took the better part of a day, and Helena spent most of it in a modest hired carriage that rattled over every rut in the forest road. Through the small window, she watched the world around her grow steadily richer the closer she came to her destination. First a handful of well-kept farms, then wide stone bridges, then rows of tall houses with iron gates, and finally, a long procession of gleaming carriages carrying noble families toward the same hall she was headed for. She had brought almost nothing with her besides the dress she wore, and a small bag holding a few coins, a change of gloves, and her father's pendant resting warm against her collarbone. She watched the passing world with a kind of quiet detachment, telling herself again and again that whatever waited for her at the end of this road, she had already survived worse. Guards in polished silver armor stood at intervals along the road, and beside them passed noblewomen wrapped in velvet cloaks, their arms full of gifts wrapped in ribbon for the future Luna. Helena watched them from behind the thin curtain of her carriage window, and felt, for the first time since accepting the invitation, the true size of the gap between the life she had built and the life this family now lived. At one bend in the road, her carriage slowed to allow a much grander one to pass, gilded and pulled by 4 matched horses, and Helena caught a glimpse of the noblewoman inside, dressed in deep violet silk, laughing at something her companion had said. For a brief moment, Helena wondered what it might have felt like to grow up inside a carriage like that, instead of watching one pass from behind a thin curtain. She let the thought pass without dwelling on it. Wondering had never once put bread on her table, and she had learned long ago not to spend too much of herself on it. When her carriage finally stopped at the base of the grand staircase leading up to Blackburn Moon Hall, she stepped down into an evening lit gold by torches, and she felt the shift in the air around her immediately. Conversations paused. Eyes moved from her simple blue dress to her plain gloves, mended at the fingertips, and then quickly away again, as though looking too long might mean having to explain the poverty they had just witnessed. A few of the older nobles recognized her name being murmured by a servant, and turned their faces deliberately in the other direction. A young page hurried forward to take her carriage's reins, glancing at her only briefly, before averting his gaze the way the others had. Helena thanked him quietly, and something in her calm, ordinary courtesy seemed to catch him off guard, as though he had expected either arrogance or shame from her, and received neither. Helena lifted her chin and walked up the stairs anyway. Inside, the hall was more dazzling than she had imagined, even from the descriptions in Elisa's invitation. Moonstone lamps lined every wall, casting a pale silver light over long banquet tables piled with food she had not seen since childhood. Roasted meats glazed dark and glistening, towers of fruit stacked higher than a child's head, small iced cakes arranged in careful rows. White flowers filled every corner of the room, and silver wolf banners hung from the high rafters, moving gently whenever a door opened somewhere in the palace. At the far end of the hall stood a raised dais, empty for now, waiting for the Alpha King who would arrive once the feast began. Helena stood near the entrance a moment longer than necessary, simply absorbing the size of it all, the sheer scale of wealth on display in a single room, before reminding herself gently that she had not come here to be dazzled. She had come to look for something much smaller and much harder to find in a room this bright. Elisa found her within minutes, moving through the crowd in her pale gold gown, radiant and confident. "Dear stepsister," she said, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear, pressing a cool cheek briefly against Helena's. Her smile did not reach her eyes. Margot appeared a moment later, embracing Helena lightly, more for the appearance of warmth than the feeling of it. "Village life has made you so practical," Margot said, her gaze sweeping over Helena's dress. "How sensible of you to dress for comfort rather than occasion." "Thank you for noticing," Helena said evenly, refusing to let the comment land the way it was meant to. "Comfort has served me well these past years." Margot's smile thinned slightly at the response, having expected either silence or embarrassment, and receiving instead a calm she had not accounted for. Helena said little else, only inclined her head politely, the way she had learned to do years ago when there was nothing to be gained from arguing. It was then that she first saw him. Alpha King Graham Blackburn entered from a side corridor, and the entire hall seemed to straighten at once, backs growing taller, voices dropping into more careful tones. He was not a man who needed to announce his presence loudly. He walked with a quiet, contained authority, his eyes moving across the room and taking in far more than he let show on his face. He did not smile easily, and he did not appear easily impressed by the glittering crowd around him. He greeted a handful of noble families near the entrance, with brief, measured words, accepting their gifts with polite thanks that carried no real warmth behind them. The practiced courtesy of someone who had performed this exact ritual too many times to feel much about it anymore. Helena watched him for only a moment before looking away, telling herself it was not her place to stare at a man who would soon belong, by title and by bond, to her stepsister. She was guided, along with the other guests, toward her assigned seat, and she found it exactly where she expected it would be, close enough to the royal table that she could see every detail of the ceremony to come, far enough that the distance itself was its own quiet insult. She settled into her chair, folded her hands in her lap, and waited. Before the feast began in earnest, an older noblewoman seated near Helena leaned toward her, with an expression that seemed, unlike most in the hall, genuinely curious rather than cruel. "You are the healer everyone is whispering about," the woman said. "My grandson speaks of a woman past the river who set his broken arm without charging him a single coin. Was that you?" Helena turned, surprised. "It may well have been," she said. I have set a great many arms over the years, and I never once thought to keep count of whose they belonged to. He speaks of you often, the woman said, a small smile touching her lined face. He says you told him pain does not care about a person's purse, and neither should healing. She studied Helena a moment longer, taking in the plain dress and mended gloves without the cold judgment so many others in the hall had shown. It seems you have already done more good in that village than most of these nobles have managed in their entire lives inside gilded halls. That is kind of you to say, Helena replied, warmed unexpectedly by the small exchange. Kindness has been in short supply for me this evening. I am grateful for it wherever I find it. The older woman patted her hand once, gently, before turning back to her own table, and Helena found herself sitting a little straighter for the rest of the feast, carrying that one small kindness, like a coal kept warm against the cold. The feast began not long after, servants moving in careful, practiced lines between the tables, filling cups and setting down heavy platters of food. Conversation rose around her in a warm, indistinct hum, none of it directed her way. A noblewoman 2 seats down glanced at Helena's dress twice before whispering something to her companion, and both women laughed softly behind their cups. Helena kept her eyes on her plate, reminding herself silently that she had not come for their approval. It was during the second course, as servants moved quickly between tables carrying heavy trays, that Helena noticed a young boy, no older than 12, struggling under the weight of a tray piled with crystal cups. A sharp-tongued noblewoman scolded him for moving too slowly, her voice rising sharply enough to draw a few curious glances from nearby tables, and his hands began to shake. "Faster, boy, before you spill something on my gown," the noblewoman snapped. Without thinking, Helena rose from her seat, crossed the small distance between them, and steadied the tray with both hands, murmuring something quiet and calming to the boy, whose name, she learned later, was Milo Norwood. "Breathe," she told him gently. "You are doing fine. No one here is worth losing your composure over." Milo's shoulders relaxed slightly, and he managed a small, grateful nod before continuing on his way, tray steadied. The noblewoman who had scolded him watched Helena with faint surprise, unsure what to make of a guest who would leave her own seat to comfort a servant, but she said nothing more, and turned back to her own conversation, as though nothing unusual had happened. From across the hall, Alpha King Graham Blackburn had seen the entire moment. He had watched Helena rise without hesitation, without any thought for how it might look for a guest in a worn dress to leave her seat and help a servant boy in front of half the noble houses in his kingdom. He had watched her speak to the boy not with pity, but with respect, as though his fear mattered as much as anyone else's in the room. It was the first time that evening his attention had truly settled on anyone. He turned to the councilman seated beside him, Dorian Bancroft, and asked quietly, "Who is that woman in blue?" Dorian glanced across the hall, following Graham's gaze. "Helena Rosewood," he said, "stepsister to Lady Elisa. I believe she was invited as a courtesy." Graham said nothing further, but his eyes returned more than once to the far table, where Helena had returned to her seat, quiet and unassuming, as though she had done nothing worth noticing at all. Across the hall, Elisa rose from her chair, smoothing the front of her gown, and turned toward the center of the room. The moment she had been planning for weeks had finally arrived. Elisa lifted her cup and waited for the murmuring in the hall to settle before she began to speak. Her voice, when it came, was smooth and practiced, carrying easily across the marble floor. "Tonight is a night about family," she said, "about loyalty, and about the honor of standing beside a man who will one day lead this entire kingdom." She let her gaze drift slowly over the crowd, gathering their attention the way a fisherman gathers a net. "And it is a special kind of honor, I think, when even those who have fallen far from noble life can still find their way back into a room like this one, if only for an evening." A ripple moved through the crowd. Some guests exchanged glances. A few near the front allowed themselves a soft laugh, quickly hidden behind raised cups. Lucille Cavendish leaned toward Rosalie Stanford and whispered something behind her fan, and Rosalie's smile widened in response. Margot rose to stand near her daughter, her voice carrying the same practiced warmth. "My stepdaughter chose to leave Rosewood Manor many years ago," she said, shaking her head, as though the memory still pained her. "She wished to live among common villagers, rather than remain with her family. We have always respected her choice, even when it broke our hearts to see her walk away." Helena sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, her spine straight. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She only let the silence stretch, and in that silence, something in her expression made several guests near her table look away, uncomfortable, though they could not have explained why. Inside, she was remembering a very different day. A cold morning, not long after her father's funeral, when she had been given a small trunk, a worn cloak, and nothing else, and told, in words far less gentle than the ones Margot was using now, that Rosewood Manor no longer had room for her. She remembered the frost on the carriage window that morning, and how she had pressed her palm against the cold glass and watched the manor disappear behind the trees, certain even then that she would never be welcomed back through its doors. She remembered, too, standing in the manor's grand foyer that morning, her father barely a week in the ground, while Margot explained in a calm, reasonable voice that a household could not support two daughters properly, and that Helena, being older and more capable of managing on her own, would surely understand why she must be the one to leave. Elisa had not been present that morning. Helena had wondered for years afterward whether her sister had even been told the truth of how she left, or whether she had simply been given a gentler story to believe instead. A driver had taken her only as far as the edge of the forest road, before turning back, unwilling to carry her further, without payment she did not have. And Helena had walked the remaining distance to the nearest village on foot, her trunk growing heavier with every mile, her father's pendant the only warmth she carried against the cold. "Helena," Elisa said, turning toward her with a smile that did not match the coldness in her eyes. "Won't you stand? Let everyone see how far you've come." The hall turned as one, every eye finding Helena's faded blue dress, her simple shoes, her plain gloves. Some guests smiled the way people smile at something they find pitiable. Others merely watched, curious to see how she would respond to such an obvious insult delivered in the gentlest possible voice. A murmur passed through the gallery. Someone near the back laughed outright, quickly stifled by a companion's elbow. Helena felt the heat rise in her face, not from shame, but from the effort of holding her composure steady under the weight of so many watching eyes. Before Helena could rise, before she could decide whether standing would be an act of dignity or an act of surrender, a different voice cut through the hall, calm and unmistakably certain. "Why," Alpha King Graham Blackburn said, stepping forward from where he had been standing near the dais, "is the woman being mocked tonight the only one in this hall who has shown any true grace?" The hall went silent, so completely that the crackle of the candles seemed suddenly loud. Elisa's smile faltered for the first time all evening. "Your Majesty," she began. "I only meant, I saw what you meant," Graham said, his tone even, giving nothing away to the crowd watching him closely. "I also saw what she did earlier this evening, when a frightened servant boy nearly dropped a tray in front of nobles who would rather scold a child than help him." His eyes moved briefly to Helena, then back to the room. "I have not yet seen anyone else at this table show the same kindness." Margot recovered quickly, offering a light, practiced laugh meant to smooth the tension from the room. "Your Majesty is generous to notice such small things," she said. "Shall we continue with the toasts?" "I would rather understand this small thing fully before we continue," Graham said, "since it seems to have drawn the attention of the entire hall already." No one answered him immediately. Elisa's hands tightened around the stem of her cup, her knuckles pale. Graham's attention remained on Helena a moment longer than was comfortable for anyone watching, and Elisa felt, for the first time that night, a small, cold thread of fear work its way into her chest. She had planned this moment for weeks, imagined it unfolding exactly as Margot described, and instead, she stood at the center of a silence she had not prepared herself for. It was then that Nina Marlowe stepped forward from among the servants lining the wall. her hands trembling around the folded cloth she still carried, as though she could no longer bear the weight of the secret she had kept for so many years. "Your Majesty," Nina said, her voice shaking but clear enough to carry. "There is something you should know before this celebration goes any further." A ripple of confusion moved through the crowd. Servants did not speak at gatherings like this one, and every noble in the hall turned to look at the old woman with open surprise, some with irritation at the interruption, others simply curious what could possibly compel a servant to step forward in front of an Alpha King. Margot's expression shifted, just slightly. A flicker of alarm quickly smoothed back into composure. "Nina," she said, her voice carrying a warning beneath its calm surface. "This is neither the time nor the place." "I am afraid it is exactly the time," Nina said, and though her hands still shook, her voice did not waver again. The hall, already quiet, seemed to hold its breath entirely. Nina Marlowe walked forward until she stood near the center of the room, an old woman in a servant's plain dress, facing a crowd of nobles who had never once looked at her directly in all her years of service. Her hands shook, but her voice did not waver again. "Helena Rosewood did not leave her family," Nina said. "She was sent away. I was there the morning it happened, and I have carried the truth of it for years, because I did not believe anyone would listen to a servant's word over a lady's." Margot's expression sharpened instantly. "This is absurd," she said, forcing a light laugh that did not reach her eyes. "Nina is an old woman confusing old memories. I have never." "You ordered every letter Helena sent to be brought to you directly," Nina said, cutting through Margot's denial with the plainness of someone who had nothing left to lose by speaking honestly. "Some you hid, some you burned. I saw you do it with my own eyes, more than once, though I said nothing at the time, because I feared for my position in this house." Gasps rippled through the nearest tables. Lucille Cavendish's fan stilled mid-motion. Even Rosalie Stanford, who had laughed so easily only moments before, sat frozen, her painted smile gone entirely. From inside her sleeve, Nina drew out a single folded letter, its edges soft and worn from age. "This is one I managed to save," she said, holding it toward the room. "Written by Helena, addressed to Elisa, many years ago." Elisa's face had gone pale. "I never received any letter," she said, and for once, there was no performance in her voice at all, only genuine confusion, and beneath it, the first cracks of real fear. Her eyes moved to her mother, searching for some denial she could believe, some explanation that would let her keep the version of her family she had always trusted. "I know," Nina said gently. "That is exactly the point." Helena rose slowly from her seat, and the hall turned to look at her again, though this time the attention felt different. No longer mocking, but uncertain, waiting. "I wrote to you many times," Helena said, her voice steady, despite the years of hurt behind it. "When I found work at the healer's shop, when I fell ill my first winter alone, and had no fire to keep me warm, when I finally began to feel that I had built something of my own out of nothing, I waited for an answer every time. None ever came." She paused, gathering herself before continuing. "I told myself, over the years, that perhaps you had simply chosen to forget me. It was easier to believe that than to imagine someone had taken the choice away from you entirely." Elisa's hands had begun to shake. She looked at her mother, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to truly see the woman standing beside her, rather than simply trusting the version of her Margot had always presented. "Mother," Elisa said quietly, "tell me this isn't true." Margot's silence answered the question more clearly than any words could have. Her eyes flicked briefly toward the gallery, gauging how many nobles were watching, then back to her daughter, searching for some way to salvage the moment that did not seem to exist. "Everything I did," Margot said finally, her voice losing some of its earlier polish, "I did to protect this family's name. A daughter thrown into poverty reflects poorly on a house trying to rise. It was easier for everyone if the story was simple." "Easier for you," Elisa said, and something in her voice cracked for the first time. "Not easier for her, not easier for me, believing my sister abandoned me when she was writing to me the entire time." The whispers that moved through the hall now were aimed at Margot rather than Helena, and Elisa stood at the center of it, her carefully built understanding of her own family collapsing around her in front of every noble house she had hoped to impress that night. Her guilt was tangled painfully with her shame, because she had spent the entire evening humiliating a woman who had done nothing wrong, based on a lie she had never once thought to question. Graham stepped closer to Helena, his voice quieter now, meant for her alone, though it still carried in the silent hall. "Why did you come tonight?" he asked, "if you believed this family no longer wanted you here?" Helena considered the question honestly before answering. "Because once, a long time ago, I loved my sister more than I cared about my own pride," she said. "I wanted to know if any part of that love still existed somewhere in this house. I think tonight I have my answer." Something in her words settled deep in Graham's chest, in a place he had not expected any stranger to reach so quickly. He had spent years surrounded by nobles who calculated every word for advantage, and here stood a woman who had just been publicly mocked, answering honestly, with no calculation in her voice at all. He turned from Helena and faced Elisa directly, his expression unreadable to the crowd, but heavy with meaning to the two women standing in front of him. "This bond will not proceed," he said, "until the truth of tonight has been fully settled." A murmur of shock swept through the gallery, nobles turning to whisper urgently to one another. Elisa's face had gone the color of the pale flowers decorating the tables, and Margot stood frozen, all her earlier composure finally gone. "Your Majesty," Margot began, "surely a family disagreement need not disrupt an entire celebration." "A family disagreement does not usually involve years of hidden letters and a woman sent from her home with nothing," Graham said, his voice calm but final. "This is no longer a small matter, Lady Margot. It will be handled properly, before the full council, and not decided tonight in the middle of a feast." No one in the hall argued further. The musicians, uncertain what to do, let their instruments fall silent, and the grand celebration that Elisa had spent weeks preparing for came to an uneasy, unfinished stop. The grand hall broke into a hushed, uneasy murmuring after Graham's words, guests whispering behind their hands, unsure whether to continue the celebration or quietly slip away. Graham did not wait to see which choice the crowd would make. He called for a private council to gather in one of the smaller chambers off the main hall, and within minutes, the room held only those the night's events truly concerned. Graham, Helena, Elisa, Margot, Nina, and two of Graham's most trusted councilmen, Dorian Bancroft and Tobias Wakefield. The heavy door closed, muffling the noise of the hall beyond it, and for the first time all evening, Helena allowed her shoulders to drop slightly, the effort of holding herself upright in front of a room full of strangers finally easing. She found a chair near the window and sank into it, suddenly aware of how tired the evening had left her, though the night was far from over. "There may be more hidden than a single letter," Nina said, once everyone had settled. "Lord Rosewood left documents before his death. I do not know everything they contained, but I know they were never meant to disappear the way they did." Elisa, still pale, looked up sharply. "The locked chest," she said, almost to herself. "In the West study, Mother has kept it locked for years. She always said it held nothing important." "It has not been opened since your father's death," Nina confirmed quietly. "I have dusted around it 100 times without ever knowing what it truly held." Margot's composure, which had held through the humiliation in the hall, finally began to crack. "Elisa, this is not the place. Send for it," Graham said simply, and 2 guards were dispatched at once, riding out toward Rosewood Manor, under the cover of night. The wait felt long to everyone in the room, though it was only a matter of hours. Helena sat quietly near the window, watching the moon climb higher over the dark trees outside, while Elisa paced without speaking, and Margot sat rigid in her chair, her earlier confidence entirely gone. Tobias Wakefield occupied himself organizing papers on a nearby table, giving the room the small mercy of something ordinary to look at, besides the tension thick enough to touch. At one point, Elisa crossed the room and sat near Helena, though not close enough to presume familiarity that had not yet been earned. "I do not know what to say to you," Elisa admitted quietly. Every word feels too small for what I did tonight. Then say nothing yet, Helena replied, not unkindly. Words said too quickly rarely mean as much as words given time to grow honest. Elisa nodded, and the two sisters sat together in silence for a while, the years between them still wide, but no longer entirely impossible to cross. When the guards finally returned, they carried a heavy iron-bound chest between them, its lock forced open sometime during the ride back. Inside, beneath a layer of old fabric, lay a collection of letters, several property seals, and finally, near the bottom, a single folded document bearing Lord Rosewood's own handwriting, dated only days before his death. Dorian Bancroft read it aloud, his voice careful and formal, the way councilmen were trained to read documents of legal weight. The document declared that a portion of Rosewood land, along with certain pack rights tied to the Rosewood bloodline, had been left directly to Helena, to be given to her upon reaching adulthood. The room went very still. Margot had not simply removed Helena from the manor all those years ago. She had removed her from the life her own father had worked to secure for her, and had done so quietly enough that no one, not even Elisa, had ever known to question it. Helena's composure finally broke, though not in the way anyone expected. She did not weep for the land, or the title, or anything material the document promised her. She wept because it meant her father had not forgotten her in his final days. He had thought of her, planned for her, tried to protect her future even as his own life was ending. And for years, she had believed she had been erased entirely from her family's memory. He never stopped thinking of me, Helena said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else in the room. All these years, I told myself I had to be strong, because no one was thinking of me at all. And he was, from the very end, still trying to make sure I would be cared for. Graham moved to stand near her, close enough to offer steadiness without overstepping what she had not invited. He said nothing for a moment, simply allowing his presence to be a quiet support beside her grief. Elisa, watching from across the room, finally spoke the apology that had been building in her chest since Nina first stepped forward. I am sorry, she said quietly. I believed what I was told, because it was easier than asking questions I was afraid of the answers to. I understand if that is not enough. Helena looked at her for a long moment. Old hurt and old love tangled together in a way that could not be untangled in a single evening. It is not enough yet, she said honestly. But I no longer believe you knew the whole truth. That matters, even if it does not heal everything at once. Margot said nothing at all, sitting very still in her chair, the weight of everything she had built collapsing quietly around her without a single word offered in her own defense. Tobias Wakefield, who had said little throughout the evening, finally spoke, his tone measured and thoughtful. Your Majesty, if I may, the document is clear in its wording, but restoring pack rights tied to a bloodline long thought, severed from noble standing, will require careful handling before the wider council. Some houses may question whether a woman raised outside noble life can rightfully hold such rights, whatever her father intended. Then those houses may bring their questions to me directly, Graham said, and I will remind them that a bloodline does not stop existing simply because it was hidden from convenient view. Lord Rosewood's wishes were clear, and they will be honored in full. Tobias inclined his head, satisfied with the answer, and made a quiet note on the papers before him. The matter settled as far as the night's business allowed. Graham addressed the room before the silence could grow uncomfortable again. This matter will be brought before the Alpha Council at dawn, he said. Until then, Helena will remain here, under my protection, as an honored guest of this house. No one argued. Later that night, once the council chamber had emptied, Graham walked with Helena through a quiet moonlit corridor, leading toward the guest wing, their footsteps the only sound echoing off the stone walls. You carried yourself tonight the way very few people in that hall could have managed, he said. Poverty never made you small, Helena. The people who used it against you only made themselves smaller in trying. Helena glanced at him, surprised by the directness of the words, and something warm moved through her chest that she was not entirely ready to name. Thank you, she said simply. It has been a long time since anyone spoke to me as though my dignity mattered more than my circumstances. Then perhaps, Graham said quietly, it is time someone did so more often. They walked the rest of the corridor in comfortable silence, and when they reached the door to her chamber, Graham inclined his head politely and bid her good night, leaving her standing alone in the doorway, with her heart beating a little faster than the evening's exhaustion could fully explain. Morning arrived cool and silver over Blackburn territory, and the Alpha Council gathered in a stone hall lit by early light rather than candlelight, the formality of daytime replacing the glamour of the previous evening. Nobles filled the gallery above, murmuring among themselves, most of them assuming Graham would find some way to protect Elisa's position as his intended Luna, despite the events of the night before. Helena sat quietly near the back of the chamber, her hands folded in her lap, watching the proceedings with the same steady composure she had carried through the entire ordeal. She had slept little, her mind turning over the discovery of her father's document again and again, but she felt, for the first time in years, a strange kind of peace settling beneath the exhaustion. Margot stood before the council when called, her earlier composure rebuilt into something colder and more careful. I acted only to protect my family's name, she said. Whatever mistakes I made them out of love for my daughter. Love does not usually require burning another daughter's letters, Dorian Bancroft said evenly from his seat among the council, and a low murmur of agreement passed through the gallery. But the council had already heard from Nina Marlowe once more, and this time, an old steward named Finian Marlowe, distantly related to Nina, and once employed at Rosewood Manor himself, stepped forward to confirm what she had said. He testified that Lord Rosewood's documents had indeed disappeared from the estate shortly after his death, at a time when only Margot had access to his private study. I remember the night the study was searched, Finian said, his voice steady despite his age. Lady Margot dismissed every servant from that wing for 2 full days. When we returned, the locked chest had been moved, and no one was permitted near it again. The council's decision, once all testimony had been heard, came without much delay. Helena's claim to her portion of Rosewood land and the pack rights tied to her bloodline would be formally restored, and a formal inquiry into Margot's conduct would follow separately, once the matter of the Luna bond had been settled. Then came the moment the entire gallery had been waiting for. Elisa rose from her seat and addressed Graham directly, her voice steadier than it had been the night before, though still touched with the fear of what his answer might be. Can the Luna ceremony still happen? She asked. I was deceived as much as anyone. I did not know the truth, any more than the council did. Graham considered her carefully before answering, and when he spoke, there was no cruelty in his voice, only a clear and settled honesty. A Luna must carry truth, mercy, and courage, he said. Whatever you did not know, you still chose humiliation over kindness last night, before any of the truth had come to light. I cannot bind myself to someone who used another woman's pain to build a celebration. The gallery stirred, murmurs rippling through the crowd, but no one spoke against him. I did not know she was innocent, Elisa said, her voice rising slightly, though not in anger, more in desperation to be understood. You did not need to know she was innocent, to choose kindness instead of cruelty, Graham replied gently. Kindness should not depend on whether someone has proven themselves worthy of it first. Elisa lowered her eyes, and in that moment, she understood fully what she had lost. Not simply a title or a bond, but the respect of a man she had genuinely hoped to build a life beside. She did not argue further. She only nodded once, accepting a truth she could not deny, however much it cost her to hear it spoken plainly in front of the entire gathered court. Graham turned then to Helena, who stood quietly near the back of the chamber, and he did not rush toward romance the way a lesser man might have, eager to claim a victory from the night's events. Instead, he asked a simple, careful question. Will you remain at Blackburn Keep as an honored guest, he said, while your rights are fully restored? There is no expectation attached to the offer, beyond safety and respect. Helena hesitated. She had learned, across many hard years, not to trust easily in the promises of powerful houses. But something in Graham's steady patience, The way he had never once pushed her further than she was willing to go, gave her a small, cautious hope she had not felt in a long time. "I will stay," she said finally, on those terms. Graham allowed himself, for the first time since the ceremony had begun, a small and genuine smile. Before the chamber dispersed, one of the older council members, a stern woman named Cassia Wakefield, distant kin to Tobias, rose from her seat, with a question that silenced the remaining murmurs. "If the Luna bond does not proceed with Lady Elisa," she said, addressing Graham directly, "what becomes of the alliance her family's house was meant to bring this kingdom? These matters were never only about affection, Your Majesty. They carry weight beyond this room." Graham met her gaze steadily. "An alliance built on a lie is no alliance at all, councilwoman," he said. "It is a debt waiting to come due at the worst possible moment. I would rather secure this kingdom's future through houses whose word can be trusted, even if that takes longer to arrange than a single evening's celebration." Cassia studied him a moment longer, then inclined her head, satisfied, and took her seat again, without further argument. A few other council members exchanged glances, some clearly still uneasy at the disruption to plans long in motion, but none willing to challenge the king's reasoning aloud. A younger council member near the back, still new enough to his seat to speak with more feeling than caution, added quietly, "For what it is worth, Your Majesty, I watched Lady Helena steady that servant boy's tray last night, before any of this truth had come out. Whatever her bloodline proves to be, her character needed no document to prove itself first." Graham nodded once, something like quiet gratitude passing briefly across his face. "That is precisely my point, councilman," he said. "Character rarely waits for permission to reveal itself. It only waits for someone willing to notice." Dorian Bancroft leaned toward Graham once the chamber began to empty. "You have made an enemy or two this morning," he said quietly, not unkindly. "I have made fewer enemies than I would have made by binding myself to a house built on hidden letters and stolen inheritance," Graham replied. "I can live with a council member's disapproval. I could not have lived with a Luna bond built on someone else's suffering." The council dispersed slowly afterward, nobles filing out in hushed clusters, already reshaping the story of the previous night into whatever version would travel fastest through Blackburn territory by morning. Margot was escorted from the chamber under quiet guard, her fate to be decided formally in the days ahead. Elisa remained behind a moment longer, watching Helena and Graham speaking quietly near the tall windows, and something in her chest, though heavy with loss, also held the smallest thread of relief that the lies her family had built for years had finally, fully, come apart. The weeks that followed passed quietly, and Helena remained at Blackburn Keep while the details of her restored inheritance moved slowly through the proper channels. She did not let the promise of land or title change the way she carried herself. Instead, she spent her days much as she always had, helping in the healing rooms of the keep, tending to injured guards, and sitting with frightened young servants who had never had anyone senior in the household speak kindly to them before. The healing rooms at Blackburn Keep were larger and better supplied than anything Helena had known in the village. Shelves lined with dried herbs she recognized, and some she did not. Clean linens stacked in careful piles, and a steady stream of guards and servants passing through, with small injuries that needed tending. She found comfort in the familiar rhythm of the work, in the simple, honest business of easing another person's pain. And within days, the keep's healer, an older woman named Adelaide, had come to rely on her steady hands, almost as much as the village healer once had. Milo Norwood, the boy whose tray she had steadied that first night, began following her quietly through the corridors whenever his duties allowed, and Helena found herself teaching him small things about herbs and wound care between his errands, the same way she once taught herself, alone, in a village far from anything resembling comfort. "Why do you bother teaching me?" Milo asked her one afternoon, watching her grind dried yarrow into a fine powder. "I am only a servant boy. I will carry trays my whole life, most likely." "You will carry whatever life you choose to build for yourself," Helena told him, not looking up from her work. "I was told once that real nobility is found in mercy, not in a title. I believe that as fully now as I did the day I first heard it. If you learn to ease someone's suffering, Milo, you have already achieved something many nobles in that grand hall will never manage in their whole lives. Milo considered this with the seriousness only a child can bring to an idea that has genuinely surprised them, and from that day on, he came to the healing rooms every chance he had, eager to learn whatever Helena was willing to teach him. Graham watched Helena from a distance at first, careful not to press his attention on her too quickly. He was not a man drawn easily to beauty alone, and he had learned, across many years of ruling, to recognize the difference between someone who performed kindness for an audience and someone whose kindness continued exactly the same, whether anyone was watching or not. Helena was entirely the second kind, and the longer he watched her, the more certain he became that he had never truly known what he was looking for in a Luna, until the night he first saw her steady, a frightened boy's shaking hands. He found reasons to visit the healing rooms more often than his duties strictly required, standing in the doorway sometimes for a long while before Helena noticed him there, watching her work with a quiet attentiveness that had nothing to do with any injury of his own. "You are here again," Helena said one afternoon, not turning from the bandage she was tying around a young guard's forearm. "I am beginning to wonder if Blackburn Keep employs an unusual number of clumsy soldiers, or if its king simply enjoys the smell of dried chamomile." Graham allowed himself a rare, genuine laugh. "Perhaps a little of both," he admitted. Their friendship grew slowly, through small moments rather than grand gestures. He brought her a set of her father's old books, recovered from Rosewood Manor's study, and sat with her one evening as she read through them for the first time in years, her fingers tracing her father's handwriting in the margins. She showed him small notes her father had left inside, a favorite line underlined twice, a brief comment scrawled in the corner of a page about mercy being a harder discipline than strength, and Graham listened with the kind of quiet attention few people had ever given her words before. They walked together in the moon garden, more evenings than either of them counted, talking of small things at first, the healing herbs she grew, the responsibilities of ruling a kingdom, the weight of decisions neither of them had chosen, but both had learned to carry. "I never wanted the crown as young as I received it," Graham admitted to her one evening, as they walked slowly along a path lined with pale night-blooming flowers. "My father died sooner than anyone expected, and I was given a kingdom before I had fully learned how to be a man, let alone a king." "That sounds lonelier than most people imagine a crown to be," Helena said. "It is," Graham agreed. "Most people only ever see the silver banners and the moonstone halls. Very few ever ask what it costs to stand beneath them every day." "I understand something of that," Helena said quietly. "Poverty and power are different burdens, but they are both heavier than they look from the outside." Graham glanced at her, something in his expression softening further. "You never once asked me for anything," he said. "Not protection, not position, not even comfort. You only ever asked for the truth." "The truth was the only thing that had ever been taken from me," Helena said. "Everything else, I learned to build for myself." Graham stopped walking, and Helena turned to face him, the moonlight settling softly over both of them. "I would like to help you build what comes next," he said, "if you would allow it. Not out of pity, and not because the council expects it of me. Because I have not met anyone in a very long time who reminded me what genuine grace looks like." Helena felt something in her chest loosen, a tension she had carried so long she had almost forgotten it was there. "I would like that," she said quietly, "as long as it is built slowly, the way trust should be." "Slowly," Graham agreed, "and honestly, I have had enough of anything built on convenience to last several lifetimes." They continued walking, and for a while, neither of them spoke, simply enjoying the quiet company of someone who did not require performance or pretense, only presence. Elisa visited Helena one quiet evening not long after, arriving without an audience, without a prepared speech, and without any attempt to soften what she had done. She found Helena sitting near the healing room fire, mending a torn cloth by candlelight, and she stood in the doorway, a long moment before speaking. "May I sit with you?" Elisa asked. Helena gestured to the chair across from her without hesitation, and Elisa settled into it slowly, her hands twisting together in her lap. "I am sorry," she said again. simpler this time than her first apology. "Not because I was caught, but because I understand now what I took from you. And I cannot give back the years. Only try to be honest going forward." Helena studied her stepsister for a long moment. Old pain still present, but no longer sharp enough to cut as deeply as it once had. "Do you remember the summer you sprained your ankle in the garden?" she asked, instead of answering directly. Elisa blinked, surprised by the sudden shift. "I remember you carried me the whole way back to the house," she said. "I remember complaining the entire time that you were walking too fast." A small smile touched Helena's mouth, despite everything. "You complained the entire time, and I carried you anyway, because that is what sisters do." "I do not forget easily," she said, more seriously now. "But I do not wish to carry bitterness forever either. We can begin again slowly, if you are willing to be patient with how long that takes." Elisa nodded, tears finally falling freely. And for the first time in years, something between the two sisters began, cautiously, to heal. They sat together by the fire a long while after that, speaking of smaller things, old memories neither of them had allowed themselves to revisit in years. And when Elisa finally rose to leave, she embraced Helena briefly, an embrace that held none of the coldness of the one they had shared the night of the ceremony. Margot's influence at court faded steadily in the weeks that followed. She was not cast out entirely, but she was quietly removed from any position where her decisions could shape another person's future, the way she had once shaped Helena's, sent to live a smaller, quieter life, away from the center of power she had spent so long protecting. Elisa visited her mother once, not long after the council's ruling. Standing in the doorway of the small house Margot had been given, far from Blackburn territory. "I do not think I can forgive you yet," Elisa told her plainly. "Perhaps not for a long while. But I wanted you to know, I do not hate you either. I only wish you had trusted me enough, all those years ago, to tell me the truth, instead of deciding for me what I was allowed to know." Margot had no answer that satisfied either of them, and Elisa left without further words, feeling lighter somehow, for having said what needed saying, even without receiving the apology she had hoped for. She visited her mother rarely in the months that followed, the wound between them still tender, though not entirely severed. As the days passed, Helena found herself settling into Blackburn Keep in ways she had not expected. She kept her habits simple, rising early to tend the herb gardens near the healing rooms, spending her afternoons with Patience and with Milo, and her evenings, more often than not, walking beside Graham through the quiet paths of the moon garden. She did not chase the comfort the keep offered her. She simply allowed herself, slowly, to trust it. The next full moon gathering arrived, with none of the tension that had haunted the last one. Helena entered Blackburn Moon Hall, not in a faded blue dress this time, but in a graceful silver blue gown, her father's pendant resting at her throat, exactly where it always had. The same nobles who had once looked away from her, now lowered their heads as she passed, no longer out of pity, but out of respect, earned rather than given freely. Lucille Cavendish, who had laughed so easily behind her fan the night of the first celebration, offered Helena a small, genuine bow as she passed. Murmuring an apology, Helena accepted with quiet grace, choosing not to dwell on old cruelty when the moment called for something better. Graham met her at the center of the hall, and before the gathered crowd, he spoke plainly, without the polished performance so many royal announcements carried. "The woman standing before you showed more grace before she ever held a title than many people show after receiving one," he said. "I do not ask her to stand beside me, because any council demands it. I ask because my heart has chosen her, freely, and I believe she deserves a future built on truth rather than convenience." Helena looked at him, then at the hall around them, at Elisa watching quietly from the side, no longer laughing, no longer scheming, simply present and, for the first time, genuinely happy for her sister. "I accept," Helena said. Graham took her hand beneath the soft light of the moon, and the hall erupted into warmth this time, not cruelty. The same nobles who had once whispered about her poverty, now witnessing exactly how far true dignity could carry a person who never once let bitterness take root in her heart. Milo watched from among the servants lining the wall, beaming with a pride that had nothing to do with the grandness of the ceremony, and everything to do with watching someone who had shown him kindness finally receive kindness of her own in return. Helena had not stolen anything from anyone that night. She had not schemed, or performed, or fought for a position she felt entitled to. She had simply remained herself through every insult and every hardship, and the truth, once it finally rose to the surface, had carried her exactly to the place she had always been meant to stand. As the music rose around them, and the hall filled with the warm light of 100 candles, Graham leaned close and spoke quietly, meant for her alone. "Whatever comes next," he said, "we will build it slowly, and we will build it honestly, exactly as you asked." "That is all I have ever wanted," Helena said softly. And for the first time in more years than she could easily count, she let herself believe that the future waiting for her might finally be a kind one. Outside the tall windows, the moon hung full and bright over Blackburn territory, the same moon that had once watched a young girl walk away from everything she knew, with nothing but a trunk and a pendant, and now watched that same woman stand at the center of a hall that had finally learned to see her clearly. The years of hardship had not broken her. They had only made the gentleness in her heart more remarkable, when it finally received the recognition it had always deserved.